On Guadalcanal, the Japanese expected to retake Henderson Field from the American Marines in August 1942. But events took a different turn. Fatigued and drenched, the Japanese troops pushed into the dark, dense bush in single file. For days, they pressed inland from the western tip of the island. Their grueling march into the forest beginning on October 16, 1942. They advanced steadily, cutting across jagged hills and worming through thick jungle. At one point, they had to hold their rifles aloft while wading the chest-deep Lunga River. Every man's load was heavy, food and supplies plus an artillery shell each, and the weapons crews suffered most, each lugging fragments of broken arms until the burden forced many to fall back toward the column's rear. Lieutenant Gen Huki Chikit's 17th Army, under Lieutenant Gen Maso Marama, included these units in its 2nd Division. Despite the hardship, they remained convinced they could defeat the U.S. Marine units and the lone U.S. Army contingent guarding Henderson Field, a crucial airstrip. The dense forest canopy hid Maruyama's column from American pilots, and the Japanese planned a surprise southern attack on October 22nd to catch the Americans off guard. The 17th Army's senior officers were so confident of victory that they intended to force an early American surrender using the code signal Bonsai. The battle-tested American leathernecks at Lunga Point, often exhausted themselves, and a regiment of green U.S. Army soldiers anticipated the main assault and prepared entrenchments and rifle pits, wrongly believing the attack would come from the west. More than 3 months earlier, as Japan pushed across the South Pacific, its forces had seized Rabaul on New Britain in January 1942, taking its large harbor and building an airbase. They then broadened their defensive ring with a major naval base at Truk in the Caroline Islands and shifted forces toward New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. In early May, the Japanese captured Tulagi, about 20 miles from Guadalcanal, the largest island in the Solomons and the Eye, headquarters of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate. And after landing a small force, they established seaplane bases there and on a nearby islet. The Imperial Japanese Navy ordered airfields built at key sites, including Guadalcanal, to strengthen that perimeter. After suffering heavy losses at the battles of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and Midway in June, 2 Japanese construction units arrived on Guadalcanal in early July 1942 and began work on the Lunga Point airfield, aiming to finish it the following month. Once completed, the strip would challenge Allied operations in the region and threaten the vital supply line between Australia and Hawaii. The Americans refused to allow that. After difficult talks among the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Chester Nimitz and other commanders agreed to seize Tulagi and the Santa Cruz Islands to establish bases, while General Douglas MacArthur was assigned to capture the northeast coast of New Guinea and then attack Rabaul. Upon learning of the airfield under construction, Nimitz was ordered on July 5th to take Guadalcanal, making its capture the principal objective of Operation Watchtower. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division organized an amphibious force of 82 Australian and U.S. ships to seize Guadalcanal and Tulagi, though the division was undermanned when the 7th Marines were sent to Samoa and replaced by the 2nd Marines from the 2nd Marine Division. Originally scheduled for early August as the United States' first ground offensive of the war, the assault was delayed 1 week in Wellington, New Zealand, so Vandegrift could load supplies and gather intelligence on Japanese strength and the island itself. Guadalcanal is roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, bisected by a mountain chain, with a northern coastal plain more suitable for military operations than the southern side. On August 7th, the task force split into 2 groups to prepare the attacks on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. After Allied naval guns pounded suspected shore defenses and carrier-based bombers struck enemy airstrips, about 3,000 U.S. Marines swarmed the beaches on Gavutu and Tulagi and held their ground after only 2 days of fighting. Meanwhile, roughly 11,300 men from the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments, excluding the 2nd Battalion, landed on Guadalcanal's northern shore about 6,000 yards east of Lunga Point. At first, the Marines met little resistance from an estimated 2,800 enemy personnel, mostly members of Japanese construction units. On the 2nd day, they again encountered only light opposition as they secured the nearly finished airfield and its facilities. uncovering 3 coastal gun batteries, a refrigeration plant, an ammunition dump, and a huge supply stockpile. The Marines quickly formed a defensive ring, expecting a Japanese counterattack along the beaches. Vandegrift massed most of his leathernecks there, put a strong line along the Ilu River called Alligator Creek by the Americans to the east, and established a western defensive belt that ran past Lunga Point and curved back toward the jungle-covered hills, while support troops manned outposts protecting the rugged southern sector. The situation worsened when the Allied carrier support group withdrew after Japanese airstrikes. In the early hours of August 9th, the Imperial Japanese fleet entered the area and engaged the amphibious task force's destroyers and cruisers off Savo Island, sinking 4 Allied cruisers and damaging 2 more while losing only 1 ship. Fearing daytime strikes, the Japanese did not press an assault on the transports. Although only half their cargo had been unloaded, the remainder of the American amphibious force sailed away after the Japanese ships returned to Rabaul. The Marines moved shore-stacked material into their perimeter and kept building the airstrip. On August 12th, they christened it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, who had been killed at Midway 2 months earlier, and that same day the first American plane landed there. 8 days later, 2 squadrons arrived, one with 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers and another with 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcats, and the air unit that grew around the field, later called the Cactus Air Force, became vital to Guadalcanal's defense. Japanese air raids, which had been nearly daily since August 7th, increased after the American carriers left, and Japanese warships shelled Marine positions at night. Patrols gathered enemy intelligence, and Vandegrift gained key local knowledge when Coast Watcher Captain Martin Clemens and his native scouts arrived on August 15th to assist. Also on August 15th, under orders from Japanese headquarters at Rabaul to retake Guadalcanal, about 900 troops of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, known as the Ichiki Detachment and led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, landed at Taivu Point under cover of darkness. This was the first reinforcement in what Americans called the Tokyo Express, the IJN's fast transport runs in the Solomons. On August 19th, the Marine Patrol wiped out Ichiki's reconnaissance party, and on the night of August 20th, 21, Ichiki's troops attacked Alligator Creek on foot. Despite their frenzied charges, they were cut down by machine gun fire, and by dawn were surrounded and methodically eliminated with the aid of light tanks, as additional Japanese forces steamed toward Guadalcanal in a convoy, including 2 naval task units and 3 aircraft carriers. U.S. carrier groups fought them in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th, sinking 3 Japanese ships, including a carrier. The next day, Japanese reinforcement convoys were driven back after strikes by planes from Henderson Field, retreating about 150 miles east of Guadalcanal. Despite the air threat, Japanese reinforcements still reached the island, and to bolster the defenders, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines was moved to Guadalcanal on August 21st. The Americans, however, still needed more troops to hold their expanding perimeter. The Marines launched a second push against enemy positions on the west side of the Matanikau River on August 27th, and while the Japanese fought fiercely by day, they often slipped away at night to avoid encirclement as they had at Alligator Creek. U.S. intelligence from Tulagi reported a large Japanese concentration near the eastern village of Taivu, so the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion were ferried in on destroyers for a reconnaissance in force under Colonel Merritt A. Edson with air support. Edson's men seized the village on September 8th, but were surprised to find far greater enemy strength than expected, by then roughly 5,200 Japanese, mainly elements of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 124th Infantry, had begun arriving at Taivu Point in late August, while another 1,000 troops had landed on the island's western shore. Kawaguchi moved southwest intending to attack Henderson Field from the south, but ran into Edson's raiders and parachute battalions dug in on Lunga Ridge, a position that would become known as Edson's Ridge. On the ridge later called Edson's Ridge, sometimes referred to as Bloody Ridge, Japanese commanders ordered relentless frontal assaults that began on September 12th and dragged on for 2 full days. but every wave was shattered by Marine defenders who poured rifle, machine gun, and artillery fire into the attackers. The losses were devastating, and when Kawaguchi's force was finally beaten back, the high command in Tokyo refused to accept defeat. Instead, they kept funneling troops into Guadalcanal, dispatching additional artillery units, elements from the 38th and 2nd Divisions, and even a tank regiment in a desperate effort to seize the island and capture Henderson Field. The Marines, meanwhile, gained a badly needed boost when the 7th Marines rejoined Vandegrift's division, a reinforcement that made it possible to establish a continuous defensive perimeter. Vandegrift organized the defenses into 10 sectors, 3 facing the shoreline and 7 turned inland, though wide gaps remained and certain approaches were still vulnerable. Disease spread quickly through the camps. Malaria and dysentery sapped the energy of Marines and aviators alike, and men were forced to operate on half rations. For the Japanese, the conditions were far worse, as the difficulties of supply were compounded by the rough jungle terrain, the inability to move cargo over the steep ridges and rivers, and the constant pounding from American air raids which attacked nearly every day. Their rations were cut to barely 1/3 of the standard issue, leaving soldiers emaciated and weakened before they even reached the battlefield, but despite this they continued to press forward. Japanese aircraft harassed the Marines constantly, bombing and strafing the perimeter while the men dug in deeper to withstand the punishment. Determined to seize the initiative, Vandegrift ordered his units to clear Japanese forces from the Matanikau sector. On October 7th, the 5th Marines, short of their 1st Battalion, struck against the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment of the 2nd Division and managed to push them back toward the mouth of the Matanikau River. At the same time, Colonel William Whaling commanded a task force made up of the 2nd Marines, 3rd Battalion, and the division's Scout Sniper Detachment, with most of the 7th Marines following behind. This combined group, later known as the Whaling Group, advanced inland to cross upriver, while the 5th Marines launched a holding attack near the coast. Supported by a company from the 1st Raider Battalion, the 5th Marines attacked the Japanese bridgehead. On October 8th, the Marines fought off a determined Japanese attempt to break through at dusk and maintained their positions as the Whaling Group forced its way across the river. Heavy rainfall delayed operations, but by October 9th, the 5th Marines and Raiders had eliminated the last Japanese troops on the east bank. While on the west bank, the Whaling Group and 7th Marines pressed northward. In 3 days of combat, with artillery batteries and infantry squads combining their firepower, Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines inflicted severe casualties, killing about 700 men from the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment. Even with such losses, the Japanese command continued to prepare for another attempt on Henderson Field. They badly miscalculated the strength of the defenders, estimating only 10,000 men were present when in reality the Marines and their reinforcements numbered more than twice that. On October 10th, Japanese inspectors reached the western end of Guadalcanal and discovered that their own battalions were under strength, artillery ammunition was scarce, and many soldiers were in poor health. Additional reinforcements were sent, and on October 13th, over 3,000 men of the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment, part of the Americal Division, landed at Lunga Point to strengthen Vandegrift's command, which now numbered more than 27,000 men. The terrain of Guadalcanal made the movement of large equipment extremely difficult. Tanks, artillery, and heavy machinery could not be hauled across the narrow rivers and thick jungles. For this reason, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, and the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines were stationed on high ground near the Matanikau River, reinforced by the 1st Special Weapons Battalion and the 11th Marines. Together, they created a horseshoe-shaped line of defense with the right flank anchored on the beach and the left tied into Hill 67. Gaps in the line were filled by patrols and machine gun nests. To strengthen their positions, the Marines laid out anti-tank and anti-personnel mines and secretly positioned a 75mm tank destroyer along with 37mm anti-tank guns. In case of a night attack, they planned to use the headlights of amphibian tractors to suddenly illuminate enemy troops advancing through the dark. Vandegrift extended the defensive ring to include more ground. Along Lunga Ridge, he organized 5 sectors. Sector 1, which included the beaches, was guarded by the 3rd Defense Battalion and part of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion, supported by engineers, amphibian tractor crews, and pioneer infantry. Sector 2 was manned by the 164th Infantry and additional Special Weapons troops, and stretched inland along the river for 4,000 yards before turning west toward the coast. Sector 3 covered the southern slope of Edson's Ridge for about 2,500 yards through dense jungle to the Lunga River, and was defended by the 7th Marines minus a battalion. Sector 4, commanded by the 1st Marines less 1 battalion, stretched 3,500 yards through thick forest from the Lunga River. Sector 5 on the western edge was the responsibility of the 5th Marines. All regiments were expected to hold 1 battalion in reserve, though this did not apply to the 1st and 7th Marines, whose battalions were tied up at Matanikau. Reserves also included the 1st Tank Battalion, the 3rd Battalion, and truck-mounted units of the 2nd Marines. Japanese planners, meanwhile, concentrated on ways to smash Henderson Field. 2 senior officers climbed Mount Austin, 6 miles southwest of the airfield, and concluded that the jungle to the south offered a practical approach and appeared undefended. A Japanese naval force simultaneously headed for Guadalcanal, but was intercepted after American patrol planes spotted them on the night of October 11th. U.S. cruisers and destroyers met them in the Battle of Cape Esperance, sinking 2 and damaging others, while aircraft from Henderson Field destroyed 2 more the next day. On October 13th, Japanese bombers hit Henderson and artillery fire landed near Kokumbona. That same night, 2 battleships opened fire on the airfield for 80 minutes and attacked the Marines grimly nicknamed Pistol Pete. The bombardment destroyed aircraft and wrecked facilities. Even as bombers continued raiding into dawn, a few B-17s managed to take off. By October 14th, Henderson Field had sustained such heavy damage that it was closed for a time, though the Cactus Air Force kept flying missions from Fighter Strip No. 1, a makeshift runway built by the Construction Battalion to the southeast. The following morning, Marines observed 5 Japanese transports unloading troops, supplies, and equipment at Tassafaronga Point with 11 cruisers as escorts. The Cactus Air Force, scraping together fuel brought in on drums from Espiritu Santo and aided by Army aircraft, got planes into the air and managed to destroy 1 transport and set 2 others ablaze, though Japanese fighters contested the skies. Even so, the Japanese evacuated successfully with 4,000 soldiers and most of their cargo. By now, Tokyo had assembled nearly 20,000 men on the island, including survivors from earlier defeats and new arrivals from the 2nd and 38th Divisions, along with tanks and artillery. Their plan was complex. A diversionary force of almost 3,000 men under an artillery commander would strike along the Matanikau coast to hold American attention, while General Maruyama's main body of 5,000 men, organized into 9 battalions of the 2nd Division, would swing inland through the jungle and attack Henderson Field from the south. Maruyama's left wing was commanded by General Nasu, his right by Kawaguchi, while a separate battalion from the 228th Regiment, known as the Coley Detachment, was to land at Coley Point by sea in the belief that another American airstrip existed there. The Japanese High Command set October 22nd as the date for the all-out assault, expecting to hear the triumphant code word Banzai once victory was achieved. On October 16th, Maruyama's left wing began its grueling march along the Moriyama Trail, a twisting path that threaded through choking vegetation and steep hills. The rest of the column followed 2 days later. Progress was agonizingly slow. The weight of artillery was so great that many crews abandoned their disassembled guns, unable to drag them through the undergrowth. The force fell behind schedule, but American defenders remained unaware of the impending attack. From their trenches and rifle pits, the Marines expected the next major assault to come from the west, clinging to assumptions even after a captured Japanese map indicated a 3-pronged invasion. Patrols sent to the south reported only ragged stragglers who were half-starved and poorly armed, and reconnaissance flights observed nothing of the main force inching through the jungle. The American defenders saw no sign that the Japanese were attempting to approach from the eastern side of the island, and nearly all their commanders were convinced that the coming attack would be launched from the west. This belief hardened on October 18th, when Japanese artillery suddenly opened fire, prompting Marine batteries to reply in kind. In the days that followed, Japanese infantry began to maneuver across the terrain to reach positions for their main assault. On the evening of October 19th, units of the 4th Infantry, together with the majority of Colonel Oka's 124th Infantry, minus a detachment, crossed the Matanikau River. They had been ordered to move into positions on Mount Austin with the intention of striking Marine forces situated east of the Matanikau from the south. The ground they faced was thickly wooded, rough, and treacherous, which not only slowed them down but also created severe delays for Maruyama's men moving toward their staging points. Colonel Nasu, commanding the remainder of the Japanese infantry, finally assembled his troops on October 22nd to prepare for the general assault. In the days before, Japanese tanks had begun probing across the river. On one occasion, 3 tanks approached, only to be greeted with 37mm fire, which disabled one and forced the others to retreat. At that night, 9 more tanks, aided by infantry, attempted to force a crossing over the sandbar. They were met by artillery and anti-tank guns, which quickly disabled another machine and forced the entire attack to be called off until the following day. Maruyama reported to General Hyakutake on October 22nd that his forces were still not in position and pleaded for a postponement. Communications with him soon broke down, however, and in the confusion orders were given for the assault to proceed regardless of his readiness. On October 23rd, the day passed relatively quietly, but around 6 in the evening, the Japanese artillery opened a massive barrage on Marine positions, shelling the horseshoe-shaped perimeter along the Matanikau, pounding the coastal road and hammering rear positions with sustained fire. Once the guns fell silent, infantry moved in. Okay's men, who were supposed to come in from the south, had been slowed by the terrain and were unable to coordinate their advance. Instead, 4 tanks of the 1st Tank Company rumbled out of the jungle toward the sandbar, only to be met by a hail of 37mm rounds. The 1st tank was destroyed before it could reach its objective. A 2nd tank managed to push forward, clearing a machine gun nest, but was stopped when Private J. Champagne courageously ran forward, detonating a grenade in its path, blowing off its track and sending it careening toward the sea where a half-track mounting a 75mm gun finished it off. The other 2 tanks, along with 5 more that attempted to cross in a second wave, were also destroyed. Marine mortars and artillery smashed the accompanying infantry, breaking their charges before they could gain ground. The Japanese suffered staggering losses, some 600 men, while the Marines lost 39. As dawn broke, Marines spotted more Japanese troops forming on high ground to their rear. These were stragglers from Oka's force who had yet to be properly positioned. To prevent them from gaining a foothold, Colonel Herman Hainen's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, was shifted east of the Horseshoe's left flank. This left Colonel Puller's battalion stretched thin, covering a sector nearly 2,500 yards wide with only platoon-level detachments, the weapons company and his command post anchoring the right side. A platoon positioned itself on a hill 1,500 yards ahead, overlooking an open, grassy expanse. Reports soon came in suggesting enemy concentration. On October 24th, a Marine patrol observed a Japanese officer scanning Edson's ridge with binoculars. Near the Lunga River, a scout sharpshooter saw smoke rising from several rice fires, a clear sign of troop activity. Native scouts passed word to the 164th Infantry that they had seen nearly 2,000 enemy troops in the vicinity. These sightings made it clear that a large-scale attack was imminent, but it was too late in the day to redeploy substantial forces. By evening, Maruyama's men were finally moving into position. The attack was scheduled for 7 p.m., but heavy rain began falling at 4 o'clock, turning the jungle paths into rivers of mud. The storm slowed the Japanese advance, and when the sun set, the darkness under the jungle canopy was so absolute that movement became nearly impossible. By 9 o'clock, the rain ceased, and the moon showed itself faintly between gaps in the trees, giving just enough light for troops to stumble forward. At 9:30, a Marine outpost near Puller's line made contact with Japanese troops and quickly withdrew into the main perimeter. Maruyama's formations had been organized with 3 rifle battalions forward and 3 in reserve, but confusion in the dark, compounded by hasty changes in command, left them disoriented. Colonel Nasu's 29th Infantry, attacking on the left, became the main striking force. At about 10 p.m., Japanese troops struck hard at the seam where the 164th Infantry and 7th Marines met. The American defenses erupted in fire. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery tore into the attackers as they attempted to break through barbed wire. Cannon fire from 37mm guns shredded entire groups, ending the first major attack in disaster for the Japanese, though their army headquarters falsely claimed the airfield had been captured. Shortly after midnight, the 29th Infantry tried again, engineers laboring to cut holes through the barbed wire. Several groups managed to squeeze through gaps in the grass, only to be cut down by machine gun fire and mortar shells. Japanese soldiers shouted their battle cries as they fell, while Marines kept the pressure with disciplined bursts and artillery. American reinforcements began to arrive, starting with 3 platoons of Colonel Robert Hall's 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, followed by the rest of the unit. Though inexperienced in combat, they were slotted into Marine lines and bolstered the defense. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, in charge of Company C's heavy machine guns, directed his men tirelessly. He carried ammunition belts to crews under fire, repaired a disabled gun on the spot, and kept 2 weapons in action despite being nearly surrounded. His valor inspired his men and earned him the Medal of Honor. Japanese troops pressed forward again at 3 a.m., with Colonel Fuyutake leading about 100 men into a temporary breakthrough, but most of his soldiers were killed or trapped in pockets, and by daybreak the Americans counterattacked and eliminated them. At 8 a.m., Japanese artillery opened a 3-hour bombardment of Henderson Field, followed by repeated airstrikes throughout the day. Torrential rain had left Fighter Strip No. 1 waterlogged and initially grounded Marine aircraft, while Japanese destroyers slipped in that morning and sank 2 American destroyer transports and 2 patrol craft. Japanese battleships joined in, shelling Lunga Point, until Marine shore batteries hit them and drove them away. Meanwhile, the Coley detachment, cut off from reinforcement, was captured, and thus Coley Point was denied to the enemy as a landing site. By afternoon, the fighter strip was dry enough to launch planes, and Marine pilots, with fuel scraped from barrels and aided by Army aircraft, managed to shoot down over 20 Japanese planes. Although the shelling and bombing that day inflicted the heaviest damage yet seen, the perimeter held. The 5th Marines shifted their line southwest to connect with the left of the 7th Marines at the Horseshoe, while the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, regrouped and secured the eastern part of the sector. Marines held firm on the slopes of Edson's Ridge as darkness again approached. That evening, Maruyama launched another desperate attempt. Nasu was put in charge of engineers and reserves, including 2 battalions of the 16th Infantry and remnants of the 29th, while Shoji's battalions covered the right flank. At 8 p.m., the Marines and Hall's infantry endured a devastating bombardment by mountain guns and mortars before groups of 30 to 200 Japanese rushed the lines. The main weight of these attacks fell on Hall's positions, but every assault was hurled back at enormous cost. Early on October 26, the 16th Infantry struck the seam between 2 battalions of the 164th Infantry, but Marine firepower, rifles, artillery, and 2 well-sighted 37mm guns broke the assault and killed about 250 men. OK, meanwhile, attacked Hanin's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines on a ridge at 3 a.m., concentrating on Company F Sergeant Mitchell Paige. Left virtually alone after his squad was wiped out, continued to man multiple machine guns, even replacing a damaged one under fire until reinforcements arrived. His bravery earned him the Medal of Honor. Though Company F was briefly forced off the ridge, Major Odell Connolly quickly assembled a scratch force of 17 Marines, including support personnel, and counterattacked. Reinforcements from the 5th Marines and Company G joined in, and by dawn the ridge was recaptured. The fighting around Henderson Field ended with horrendous losses. Japanese dead were estimated at over 2,200, while American casualties totaled 86 killed and 192 wounded. The Marines had held their ground through deep entrenchments, strong artillery support, and lines of barbed wire that slowed every charge. Puller later summarized it simply: We held them because we were well dug in, we had artillery, and there was plenty of wire. By October 26, the battered Japanese 17th Army was forced to abandon its attempt to storm the perimeter. While at sea, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands raged. Over 2 days, the U.S. Navy lost a carrier, a destroyer, and 74 aircraft, while Japan lost more than 100 planes and suffered heavy damage to several warships. Although the Japanese withdrew, the battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. In the following weeks, further naval engagements occurred. The Americans cleared Coley Point and the Matanikau, and by December, the weary 1st Marine Division, thin and worn down by months of combat, was finally relieved. Fresh U.S. Army troops from the American Division, commanded by Major General Alexander M. Paige, arrived to continue the struggle, marking